talking corporate governance. Ansie Ramalho, our guest in the studio, she's Chief Executive at the Institute of Directors in South Africa. Let's go back to where we were before the break there, Ansie. The three different areas I wanted to look at. SMEs. I'm running a small company, got a certain amount of employees, I work within a community, I utilize resources from that community. What should I be doing from a corporate governance point of view there?
Again, as I've said before, Jeremy, we can never see corporate governance out of context. So always those old things about comply with legislation, but then go beyond just merely complying with legislation and conduct the business in the spirit of good corporate citizenship. Look after the employees in a fair manner. Look after the impact that you have on the society within which you operate. And even if we look at structures, if we look at SMEs, typically family companies, one of their huge risks is lack of succession planning and dependency on the founder of the business. Sound governance protects that business against those risks. So what we're saying is, if you want to, as a small business owner, position yourself for growth, you'll have to get to a stage where you need to say, I can't be all of it to this business. We need to bring an independent director on board, and there are all sorts of ways to do it so that it's practically executable and affordable to that small business. Put a succession plan in place. Succession planning is part of corporate governance. Those are the useful kind of things that we're talking about. It's never meant to be a hurdle or just a compliance nuisance.
Let's then hop straight then to the state enterprises, because there you're talking about a totally different animal, I would imagine, because there are all sorts of other parties involved. You have government involved, which must be very trying at times, to be honest. And you also have all sorts of almost restrictions, unless you're ESCOM. But it's a different field that you're playing on.
It is completely different, and it's not. There's actually no reason why sound governance principles, as they apply in a private company, should not also apply in a public sector company.
Why is it that it seems that they don't?
You were quite right when you said that there are restrictions, legislation. What makes it difficult is that legislative requirements sometimes go against sound governance principles. The way that the board is sometimes composed, and it's required to be composed in that way by legislation, means that there's, for instance, a lack of independence, or that the agenda of the party that is represented is driven instead of the best interest of the entity. If we look at local government, for instance, municipalities, the way that the councillors, and councillors you can equate in this sense to directors of a company, the way that the councillors get elected is democratic. But once they sit on that council, they are bound by legislation to vote the party line. Now we pose the question, what if the party line is not in the best interest of the community that municipality serves? I mean, ideally speaking, it should be. Ideally a party should want to, but we know in practice it doesn't always work that way. So the individual sitting there doesn't have the power to vote otherwise, even if he or she knows that it's actually working against the community.
But I mean, you would probably be more aware of this than anyone. I've never been aware of any private entity, as opposed to a parastatal, a private entity who has had somebody as their MD being suspended and then being reinstated and being on full pay and bonuses for 3 years. I mean, that just doesn't happen in the private sector. And so that to me means that the level of corporate governance in parastatals is not nearly where it should be.
Agreed. I agree with you completely, Jeremy. And the reason is I think the functionaries within the governance system, they don't always understand the role that they're playing. If a shareholder then appoints the chief executive, which we are also saying is bad governance practice, but sometimes legislation requires it, that shareholder can't take 6 months to a year to make that decision. It needs to be made immediately. We all know what happens when people only act, you know, they don't take ownership of what they're doing, and who can blame them? So there are all of these restrictions, and the shareholder, government, the board, the CEO, all of those people and management need to understand what their role in terms of corporate governance is. And if all of them play the role as it should be done, there wouldn't be an issue. But unfortunately, like you say, there are restrictions, and the board feels that it cannot move because it's restricted by what government requires of it. Government is, of course, not only the shareholder in state-owned entities. You know, in a private company, for instance, a board would devise the strategy and decide upon the strategy for that company. In government, it's the shareholder or sometimes the policy-making department, which may be a different department from the shareholder, which would determine policy. It's a very difficult environment to operate within.
Let's move on to the King thing. How did the King thing all come about now? Was that trying to put it together and put it down on a document and say, there?
The King Committee was established in 1992 with Mervyn King chairing it, and he's chairing it to this day, as you know. It started off as the IODSA, the way the story's been conveyed to me, as the IODSA at a visit to London, there was a discussion with Lord Adrian Cadbury, and we started to understand. And remember, corporate governance was in its infant shoes then.
Was he the Sweetie Oak?
Yes, he's the Sweetie Oak.
Oh,
yeah, he's from the Sweetie family.
Oh, okay, right.
And we started to understand what it was about, and then the King Committee was convened. It was a very small committee then. It was a very small report that was issued in 93, just after the Cadbury report, only a couple of pages. Then as the thinking around, and then you know how fast governance then developed and evolved from there. It just because I think it happened at the right time. It was just after the Maxwell disasters in Britain, and people started to see this as perhaps something that could bring this animal of business that was perceived to be completely out of line into its proper role. And so the King 2 report followed in 2002, quite coincidentally, also just after Enron. And then King 3 was issued, the third report, in 2009. Now, the King Committee that issued the King report, only 2 of the original committee members was left by that time. But that's why. The committee is 20-something members big. We still meet ever so often to discuss corporate governance developments, and further initiatives that are ancillary to the King report. I mean, one of those developments is, for instance, the Code for Responsible Investing that was launched middle of last month, which is meant to supplement what the King report is doing.
One of your big things is sustainability. Where does that come from? Tell me more about that.
Much of the corporate governance thinking now is informed about sustainability.
In what way?
In that, and that's part of the ethical debate about what constitutes ethics for companies. If I go back to the Brundtland report, the Brundtland definition that was used in the 80s, which said that businesses must conduct their business in such a way so as to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs.
So basically you're saying a business must be sustainable on its own. It must continue to make a profit because otherwise it will not be sustainable.
Exactly.
But it needs to take into account everything around it and be sustainable within that environment as well.
Exactly. So it's not about only going concern considerations for the business itself. The scope is wider. It must take into account sustainability of our lifestyle, so to speak, of keeping on doing business in this way so that future generations still have an earth to operate within or to live on.
One of my favorite sayings is former Pick n Pay chairman Raymond Ackerman saying that doing good is good business. And I think it applies, he said that years ago, and I think it applies even more now across a whole range of issues. If there's somebody watching who has a small company and they are looking at this whole aspect of corporate governance, can they get information from the Institute of Directors?
Yes, we can be contacted. All our contact details are on our website, www.iodsa.co.za. And Jeremy, you are quite, I feel so strongly about it, that sustainability is a business opportunity. It's not something that should be seen as a hurdle to business, as compliance or just a do-good thing. Do good is good for business. I absolutely agree with it. It's only when one understands, in short, that bigger environment, and here I'm talking about natural environment and I'm talking about the communities. It's only when businesses understand that environment that businesses are open to opportunities. How do you devise strategy if you don't understand what impact the communities within which you operate, the society, and the natural environment has on your business? How do you devise strategy? And in that way, I'm saying I agree, it's good for business. Absolutely.
Ansie, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Ansie Ramalho, Chief Executive of the Institute of Directors in South Africa.